Welcome into our complete CSS course. If you only know HTML and you just want to make some things that are pretty across the web, this is going to be the video for you. We're going to take complete beginner steps and look at how everything fits together, and then we're incrementally going to increase the difficulty level until we get to advanced topics and go completely professional. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what you can do with CSS, but really the best example of what you can achieve with CSS is going to be if you think of the prettiest or most awesome, best looking or best user experience you've ever had on the web or with an app that exists for browsers. That's going to be your example. CSS is the way to get things to look the way that you want them to look. It doesn't matter if you need it some kind of a complex look or some over-designed super system, or if you want something completely simple and easy to glance over. CSS is what defines how things look. So what's the expected knowledge going into this? Well, you should know HTML, just basic HTML. If you don't, we have a 4-minute video that goes through just the simplest HTML. So just watch that and then come back here if you don't know HTML already. If you want a little bit of a slower walkthrough, there's a full course on that on the YouTube channel as well, and I'll put a link to that here as well. So who am I? My name is Henrik. I'm a software engineer, I'm a full stack developer, and I'm a lecturer at the Danish universities. And right now, we're going to be diving into the front end part of what you do with web development. We already covered HTML in the courses that I mentioned before. Now we're going to dive into CSS. Now you might be thinking, I've heard of Sass CSS. It's supposed to be way better than CSS. And sure, Sass CSS does have some features that make the experience way better when you're developing. But the thing you need to understand is that Sass CSS is mapped to actual CSS. So if you have a problem with your Sass CSS, you won't be able to do any kind of debugging if you don't learn actual CSS. So even if you want to learn Sass CSS, learn real CSS first, then jump into Sass CSS. So let's get an overview of CSS. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And just like HTML, it's a domain-specific language. So that means it's not one of these Turing-complete programming languages that you can bend to your will and make it do everything that you can possibly do with any other programming language. No, CSS has a very specific purpose. It's made to define how HTML looks. So you have your HTML page with your content and you use the CSS to define how that page looks. That's what CSS does, nothing else. It defines the colors, the sizes, the fonts, placement, animation, and a bunch of other things. Everything you can think of that has to do with how things look and how they react is defined by CSS. Generally, it's made up of selectors and properties. So when you do CSS, you have a selector, and when you define that selector, then that's going to be your scope, and inside that scope, you set values for properties. Let's take an example here. Let's say that H1, that's going to be a headline. That's going to be our selector. We want to do something with all the headlines on a page. In this instance, we want to change the property color to have the value red. So what that's going to mean is that every time we have an H1 headline, that's going to be red when we have this CSS. So color is the property and red is the value. Now, when we work with it, we generally want to jump out into our browsers and get an overview of the HTML that we're working with. And we also have an overview of the CSS that goes into the HTML element that we select in our HTML overview. You can get to this view in your browser by right-clicking on any element and saying inspect. When you do that, you get these fields. This is from a Chrome browser. It looks a little bit different than the other browsers, but not so different actually that you won't be able to find your way around it if you follow along with this video. So notice that there's actually a little bit of CSS going on down here, even though we haven't defined any CSS. And that's because your browser already has some CSS that's defined as standard for what certain things are going to look like. That's why your H1 header is bigger than your paragraph text. And so the general way that you'll want to work with CSS is often actually to open your HTML in a browser, open the inspector on the thing that you want to change the look of, and then play around with the CSS directly here in the browser tools. And once things look the way that you want them to look, you know exactly what elements you need to change the properties of, and you can jump back into your CSS and make the change there, refresh your page, and everything looks great. Now there's a couple of different ways that we can add CSS to our HTML document. The first and simplest is to use the style attribute in HTML. When you use the style attribute inside the quotation marks, you have actual CSS code. You can also use the style element. When you do that, you need to use the selector that we discussed before. And you can, of course, import a CSS file. And this is generally the way that you want to do things, both because you can import the same CSS file to a bunch of different HTML documents and then have the same CSS do the same things to make things look similar across your pages, but also because you want a separation of concerns. So generally, you'll want the HTML file to be concerned with only the resources, the content, and the structure. So you could technically say that a regular author would sit down and write an HTML document, whereas a designer would sit down and write the CSS. So you don't want your designer to fiddle around with the text. You don't want them to write your content, and you don't want your content writer to design your page. So that's the separation of concerns that we're trying to achieve by removing the CSS from the HTML file. So it is possible to do it inside the HTML file, but think of the advantages and try to move as much of it as possible out into its own CSS files. Now, when you have a CSS file, you can actually import more CSS files from that CSS file. You can use the add import function and then add a URL to it. And that way you can import more CSS files. The benefit of doing that is that your HTML author will only have to import one document, and then you, the designer, can figure out what documents you need to actually work with. So if you have 3, 4, 10, 20 different CSS files, then you can import them all in your own CSS file, and you can still make the separation that you want, because in CSS, you often end up with a whole bunch of things that do a little bit of something for one thing and for another thing. So maybe you'll want to have a CSS document that's only concerned with the menu, another one that's concerned with the images, another one that's concerned with the headlines. And so you can make that division by putting it into different files. Now, just like any other programming language, you can add comments to CSS. You do that with /*, and then you write your comment, and the comment ends when you write */. You can have it in multiple lines and all of that. Now, a fair warning, if you're used to working with other programming languages where you can do this, for instance, PHP, Java, JavaScript, C#, a lot of other programming languages, you can make comments like this, and then you can also make comments with 2 /, and that's going to make a comment that ends when you make a line break. That's not the case for CSS. If you do that in CSS, you're going to break the syntax, and that means that everything that comes after that quote-unquote comment is not going to work. So you're just going to break your CSS document by doing that. The only way to make comments in CSS is with /*, and then until you have your */ to end it. So let's start with the simplest selector. We already saw this one, but here we're just selecting the element type. So if we have an H1, we just write H1 as our selector, that's the yellow text. If we had a paragraph, we would write a P. If we had an image, we would write IMG, and that goes for all HTML elements that exist. So in this case, we're coloring the H1 headlines dark gray. The next way that you might set up your selector is to point to the ID. Now remember, an ID should be unique for one element. You cannot have 2 elements on the same HTML page with the same ID, but you point to that ID by using the hashtag and then the ID. And in this instance, we're coloring the headline orange. We can also use the class attribute. In this instance, we have a class called red, and we're coloring the headline red by pointing to that class with a dot. So dots in CSS denote that we're pointing to a class attribute. Now, sometimes you want to require multiple classes. I can actually add multiple classes in HTML like this. I just separate them by a space. And then in my CSS, if I want to do something special, when an element has both classes, then I just say .red and .blue without any space or anything between. It's important that there's no space in between. You'll see why in a moment. But then when they have both the red and the blue class, they'll get the color purple in this example. Now, maybe you have something that's nested. So in this case, we have 2 different paragraphs, and the first one has the class special. Now, inside both of these paragraphs, we have a little bit of texts that's emphasized, and we want to color the emphasized text in the special paragraph purple, but not the emphasized text in the other paragraph. So we do that by pointing to the class once again with a dot first, so dot special to denote the class special, and then a space, and then EM to say that we want any emphasized elements inside of any element that has the class special. So here we get the text emphasize this in purple in the first paragraph. In this example, we have 2 paragraphs that have two different classes. And we want to hit both of them. So if it's red, we want to set the color to red. If it has the class blue, we want to set the color to blue. But they're both going to have one thing in common. They're both going to have the background color be pink. So the way that we set that up, instead of writing it twice, we just say that if the class is blue or red, then the background color is going to be pink. And the way we set that up is we say .blue to denote the class, .red to denote that class, and then we put a comma in between. So we can have as long of a selector that we want with spaces and multiple selectors, IDs and classes and all that. And then have a comma and then start all over for another selector that we also want to get those same properties under it. Now we also have something called pseudo classes. So in this example, we have a paragraph element with the class price, and it just says 1,000. That's not really good. We want it to be $1,000 and we want it to be plus VAT. So what we're doing here is that we say that for the class price, before that, we want to add some content. And that content is going to be a $sign and a space. After the element that has the class price, we want to have the content space plus VAT. And the result ends up looking like this. So the only text here that actually came from the HTML was 1,000. What comes before, what comes after was inserted by the CSS via the pseudo classes before and after. Now, if you go into your browser tools or into your inspector and you look through the HTML, you'll actually see the before and the after elements before and after your regular HTML elements. And you can click on them and you can change their CSS. And you can do other things besides inserting content. That's just a special one that works with before and after. But you can change the display types and colors and all the things that you can do with CSS with these elements as well. We also have link pseudo classes. And here we've defined it so that links are colored brown, but if you hover over them with the mouse, they're colored red. And if you already visited them, they're colored dark gray. We also have a pseudo selector called a type selector. We can take an input and say, if this input has the type text, then we want something to happen. If it has the type submit, we want something else to happen. In this case, we're coloring the background colors. So the input field for the text is going to have a light blue background color, and the submit button is going to have a purple background color. Now, sometimes you're going to have conflicting styles. In this example, we have an H1 header that has a class red, the ID blue, and an inline style that colors it orange. But we then say that the elements with the class red gets the color red, and elements with the ID blue gets the color blue. We're saying that this headline needs to be red, blue, and orange. What's going to happen? Well, it becomes orange. What then if we say that it's really important that it becomes red? We add this word to it, exclamation point, important. Now it's going to become red. Why is that? In CSS, we work with a concept called specificity. If you're used to other programming languages, you might just expect that each element gets whatever attribute is assigned as the last thing. So, if you color it green, then it becomes green. But then if you color it blue, then it becomes blue. That's not the way CSS works. The way CSS works is that it looks at your selectors to figure out what's most specific. So your important keyword is going to be more important than the style attribute, but the style attribute is going to be more important than the IDs, which are more important than the classes, which are more important than the element types. You could look at it in this way that you can see in this table, where you get points for using different types. So if you use 2 classes, that's more specific than 1. If you use an ID and a class, that's more specific than just using an ID. So if we take the rows from the beginning, a div.text, that would be an element and a class. So you get 11 points, 1 for the element and 10 for the class. If you say elements of the type div with the ID title and nested under that any B elements, then you have the B element, the div element, that's 2 points, and you have the title. So that's going to be 100 points for the title. Now, generally you wouldn't write div ID title, you'd just write ID title because you're not going to have something else that has the ID title, but this is just to show the point system. Next up, we have a link, an A element with the pseudo class hover. So that's going to get 10 points for the pseudo class and 1 point for the element type. Next up, we have an inline element, and inline elements get 1,000 points. But obviously you cannot add any other selectors to it because the selector is implicit by the inline style being inside an HTML element. And as the last example, we have an A element. So we only actually get 1 point for specifying the element type, but then we get 10,000 points for adding the keyword important. This is plenty to know exactly what selector is going to work for you. And if you're in doubt, if you don't understand why your style isn't coming through, well, you can try the important keyword, but you can also go into the browser, right-click on your element, use the browser tools to look at it. In this example right here, we can see that the color is orange. We can also see that it accepted that everything that has the ID blue gets the color blue, but there's a line through it. So the browser is telling you, I saw this, I know that you wanted it to be blue, but it's not blue. I have something that's more specific. I also know you wanted it to be red, but I had something that was more specific. Same goes for dark gray. So now that we have a really good handle on our selectors and we know exactly how to reach the specific elements that we want to reach with our CSS, let's add some properties and some values to it. And we're going to start with sizes and placing of the elements. So as I move the mouse over the HTML elements here, I can see that they're marked on the screen, and the blue is going to be the content and the orange is going to be the margin. But everything has its own line except this little piece of text that says emphasize this. And that's because the paragraphs are block elements. So that means they're going to fill up the whole line and make a line break after it. If we turn them into inline elements, then they'll be treated like the text that says emphasize this. So if I say that both paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 are inline elements, you can see they jump up onto the same line. If I turn it on and off, you can see how they either get a full line to themselves or get on the same line. Now, if I say that this is inline and I then add a width to it, I don't get the width of 300 pixels that I would expect. But if I use an inline block instead, then you can see that we actually do get the width, but we still don't get that line break. And that's one of the powers of inline blocks. They don't take up the whole space. So paragraphs by default are blocks, and italic, emphasize, bold elements like that by default are inline. In this little table, you can see the difference between blocks, and inline elements. So when you have a block, you can set the height and the width, and you automatically get a line break right after the block. If you have an inline element, it doesn't care if you set a height and a width. It's just going to ignore that. And it's not going to add a line break either. It's made for pieces of text within a piece of text. And then you have the happy medium, the inline block, where you do get to set your height and your width, but you don't get that line break at the end. One of the powers of inline blocks is that when you put them next to each other and you make the browser windows smaller and more narrow or more wide, it's just going to fit as many as it can onto the screen. And when you can't have any more on the screen, it's just going to put them down under instead. So if you have a website where you want an image with some text next to it, and then when you view it on a mobile phone where the screen is super narrow, the text should be underneath it instead, well, chances are you can just make these two elements inline blocks, and that's going to work without any further programming. The next thing you need to know about CSS is the box model. This is an important concept to understand. Every HTML element has content of some form. Around your content, you're going to have padding. Around that, you have a border. And around the border, you have your margin. Now, if you have two elements, the margins are going to go up to each other. So the margin specifies the amount of space that you want before another element. But if the element that comes up next to it also has a margin, you can add those two margins to each other to figure out how much space is going to be between the two. So if these two elements have a margin of 10 pixels all the way around, there's actually going to be 20 pixels between their borders. Now let's take a look at this in action. We have 5 elements here that are made as inline blocks, and they have a background color of light blue. They have some padding, a border, and a margin. As I hover over them, I can see those parts of it in the browser. And when I scroll down, I can actually see the box model, and I can see what the padding, border, and margin is. And when I hover over the elements, I can see the colors from the box model showing me what's the content, padding, border, and margin on each element. So let's talk about margin. I'm just going to turn off the standard margin, and then I'm going to work with one of these elements directly. So I'm setting a margin to 20 pixels. That's going to give me a margin of 20 pixels all the way around. But on the left side, I want it to be 50 pixels. So I just changed that text. Now I'm turning both of these off just to show that margin inline property can be set to, let's say, 100 pixels, and that's going to make the margin on the left and the right be 100 pixels, but it's not going to touch the margin on the top and the bottom. I can also say that the margin is going to be 10 pixel and then a space to 20 pixels. That's going to give me 10 pixels of space on the top and the bottom and 20 pixels of space on the left and on the right. I could actually continue from here to write 2 more numbers so that I would have a total of 4 numbers, and that would let me define the margin at the top, right, bottom, and left. So you start at the top, then you go clockwise around. A special thing about margins is that margins can actually be negative. So when you define how much space you want to the next element, you can actually say that you want a negative number. When you do that, here I'm taking element number 2 and I'm giving it a left margin of minus 20 pixels. I'm actually turning it down to minus 50 pixels. And when I do that, it almost completely overlaps the first element. And that's done by just setting a negative margin on it. And I can even move things out of the screen that way if I want to. In this example, I've set up just a single box. This is actually a block, but it has a width. And when I set the margin to 0 auto, it's going to be centered on the page. So that's how you center a block. You just give it a width and set the margin to 0 auto. If it's an inline block, this doesn't work. It has to be a block. So in the box model, inside the margins, you have your border. So let's take a look at the border. I turned them off here. And then I just work with the border for the second element. So let's start with the border style. I can say it's solid. Then I set up the border color to be red and the border width to be 10 pixels. And just like with the margin, I could add 2 numbers to get top bottom with the first number and left right with the second number, or I can add 4 numbers to get different border sizes on the top, right, bottom, and left. Once again, clockwise from the top. I can also replace all of these attributes with just the border attribute and say that the border is going to be 20 pixels solid gray. And then I can override the border on the left by just saying border left is going to be 0 pixels. So let's take a look at that border style. I made it solid just before, but in this instance, I made it dashed. It looks a little bit odd here. So let me change the border width. I can also make it dotted, but you can try this out. And the great thing about working with these things in the browser is that you get that list where you can just hover over each of the values that you can select from and see how it looks directly in the browser. Another thing you can do with the border is that you can set the roundness of an object. So if you look at the first element, it has slightly rounded corners now, and now it has extremely rounded corners. And I changed that by changing the border radius. That's also how you actually make circles. You just make something that has the same width and height, and then give it a border radius that's at least half as big as the width of the element. Inside your border, you have your padding. And once again, let's try and turn it off and then just play around with the padding of the second element. So I'm going to set padding to 10 pixels to get it all the way around, 20 pixels to get top, bottom, left, right, and 10, 20, 30, 40 to get different padding on the top, right, bottom, left. Once again, start from the top and go clockwise. Now I can change the padding on the left to 100 pixels with the padding left attribute. We also have a concept called box sizing. Let me start with the problem that we're trying to solve. Right now I have 2 boxes with different sizes of content inside of them, but I'm just setting the width and the height to 200 pixels and 100 pixels to get 2 boxes that have the same size no matter the size of the content. Now I want a little bit of padding here, and when I get that padding, the box grows bigger. And I could of course do some math to calculate what should be the right size, but that's going to be terrible when I sit there and work with it. I want to just set the size of the box and then work from there. So I'm setting the box sizing to border box. And when I do that, then my padding becomes something that pushes my content in from the border instead of pushing the border out from the content. Here I've added a huge image, but I'm just setting the width attribute to 100%. And then I'm adding a minimum width of 400 pixels and a maximum width of 600 pixels. That way, the image is going to be as wide as the screen is, but never less than 400 pixels, never more than 600 pixels. So you can see what happens when I scroll it too little, the face disappears, and too big, I get this white background visible. In this example though, I put the image inside of a div, and that div has a width and a height of 250 pixels. So if I say that the image gets a height and a width of 100%, that means 100% of the parent, so of that div. But I don't want that. I want it to fill out the space no matter the size of the parent. So I use the view width and the view height instead. And that way I can make the browser window much wider and get a much prettier dog. Now, obviously we don't want the dog to be that wide. So we have the object fit that can tell us if we want to fill or contain or cover. I love using the cover value on this attribute because it just makes sure that the space you've defined is always going to be filled out with an image. And then it just puts whatever amount of image over and under it or to the sides of it that's needed to make sure that you have as much image visible as possible without stretching it. Next up, let's talk about positioning. Let's start with something simple. In this example, I have some content in a div, and then under it I have a headline, a paragraph, and another paragraph. Now, when I change that div element to be float left, then everything that was supposed to go under it just goes up to the side of it. And when I say float right, then it goes over to the right side, and still the text comes up next to it rather than going under it. Now, something that's a little bit more complex is the position attribute. So with position, you can position your element relative, so that's relative to its parent. And then you can say top and left and give that a size. So that's how many pixels you want as your distance to the top and to the left. But if you get the position as absolute, then you're giving it an absolute position inside the whole document. And if you set the position to fixed, then you're setting a fixed position inside the window. So even when you scroll, it keeps its position. Now, I can use right instead of left. I can use bottom instead of top if that's where I want my box to be. But generally, you shouldn't use left and right at the same time or top and bottom at the same time. The only place you want to do that is when you want to center an absolutely placed element. Then you need to set the margin to 0 auto and left and right to 0 pixels, both of them. That way you're going to get it centered. And when we're working with these things, we start to have elements that overlap. So what if I actually want this element to be behind the other ones? I can set the set index to a negative number or to a positive number, and the set index should be viewed like layers. So you can set it up to a maximum of 999 and a minimum of minus 999. And that's just going to give you almost 2000 different layers that you can add your elements into and define where they should be over and under each other. Now, one of the more complex ways to set up your positioning is to use what's called a Flexbox. The idea with a Flexbox is that you have one element that sets the size of the whole box, and then the elements inside of that box can be positioned. So in this instance, I've given the parent box the class Flexbox, and inside that I created 3 other boxes. One of them I called special and colored red, just so that we can see the difference between them inside the Flexbox. So this is what it looks like by default. And if I go into the actual Flexbox around it and I set the flex direction to column, you can see that I get the boxes under each other instead of after each other. I can also set the property called justify content, and I can set that to center, and that's going to center it in the direction that's set by the flex direction. I can also set it to space around, space between, or space evenly to get different kinds of spacing within my Flexbox. Now let's go down to this special element and set the flex attribute to 2. Since the flex attribute isn't set on any of the other elements, this is just going to allow that element to take up all of the space that exists between the 2 other boxes. I can also use the Flexbox to distribute my elements. So let me go down to the special element and just disable that flex again. And we can now see that we're using the space between in the justify content. And if I give the div elements a width of 100%, what you can see is that each element isn't getting 100% as their width. They're sharing 100% of their width. And that means that we can now do proportional sizing by using the flex property. And if I set that to 1 on all the divs, but I change it to 2 or even 3 on the special element, then that element becomes 3 times wider than each of the 2 other ones. We can also use this to center. So let me just remove these flex attributes and change the justify content to center. Now I can add another property called align items and also set that to center. And now we have our elements centered both horizontally and vertically inside of our Flexbox. Lastly, I just want to fill this up with my full rows and columns. So I'm setting the height to 100%. And now I'm filling up the Flexbox with these 3 custom sized columns. And I can do the same if I set the flex direction to column, then I just have to set the width of the divs to 100% as well. Now that we've got a handle on positioning items on a page, let's talk about some different things that you want to put on a page. One thing is images. Obviously, you can put images into your page with HTML, and you generally should if that image is part of the content. But if you just add a pattern or even a real life image as a background, that's not relevant to the content. You can look at it this way. If you have a screen reader, would it be important for that screen reader to tell you what's on that image? Or you can look at it in another way saying, if that image wasn't there, would that be a problem? Is it just a background for something else, for some text or whatever? In that case, it's just a background. And background images, we can add those with CSS. So if we go into an element and we set the property background image, then we can set a URL to dog.jpg because I have an image of a dog in the same folder here. Now, this is a huge image, so that's why it's just becoming gray, but I can set the background size to cover. That's the same as the object fit we did earlier. And then I can set the background position to either the bottom or the top or the center. I can also use left and right here. And by the way, you can do the same thing for images that you want that object fit on that we talked about earlier. Another thing that we can do with images, now that we have one, is that we can set filters on them. So we have blur, brightness, contrast, drop shadow, grayscale, hue, rotate, bunch of different filters. I'm using grayscale here, and I just want to show you that it's only possible to add one filter at a time. So if you try to add another one, then that one's just going to be visible instead. And when we talk about CSS, we also need to talk about colors. So in this instance, I'm just changing the background color of this box. But instead of using the word for a color, now I'm using hex codes. So I have 6 total characters here that go from 00 to FF. That gives me the hex values for the numbers from 0 to 255. And that's generally the way that you specify colors on the web. You can also use RGB. That's also going to let you use 3 values between 0 and 255 for red, green, and blue, just like the hex colors were, but this is perhaps a little bit easier for some people to read. The cool thing about this is that you can add an A to it so that it says RGBA, and then you can add a 4th value that's going to be the alpha channel. So that's going to set the opacity of that background color. In this instance, 0.1 is going to give it a visibility or an opacity of 10%. And when we have that opacity, we can set the opacity as its own attribute actually. So here I'm using div hover to set the opacity to 0.2. So that's going to give me 20% opacity. And then I'm setting a transition to say ease in out 2 seconds. Now when I jump over into the browser, I refresh, when I hover my mouse over it, it's going to slowly transition to that low opacity. But when I move the mouse out, it just clicked on to the full opacity again. So I need to go into the element without the hover pseudo class and add that transition ease in out 2 seconds as well. And then I get the transition both when I move the mouse in and when I move it out again. Another thing you might want to do with colors is set up a gradient. And even though you're defining colors here, you need to use the background image attribute for it. So the background image is going to be a linear gradient. We start with the direction that we want the gradient to go to. You can skip that and then just go directly into colors. But the reason is you can actually define as many colors as you want. So if you want to create a whole rainbow with this, you can do that. Now the first one with the direction, you can set it to left or to bottom or to right. But you can also just set a number and then the letters DEG to say that that's going to be the number of degrees. You can also change the word linear to radial if you want to have a radial or a round gradient instead. And of course, you can use the same colors here. You can use transparent, you can use words for colors, you can use the color codes that we just discussed. Another thing you can do is add shadows. So you can add a box shadow here. I'm adding that to this big element. I'm saying that I need it to be 10 pixels below and 10 pixels to the right. Now I'm changing it to be minus 10 pixels to the right, minus 10 pixels below. So that's going to be 10 pixels to the left and 10 pixels on top. I can add a third number here to say how much blur I want on this box shadow. And then of course I can add the color. In this instance, I've added red. I can do the exact same thing for text. So if I'm changing this to text shadow, it's going to turn into a text shadow, and the same numbers apply for pushing the shadow to the side or up or down, and to setting the blur and the color of it. And I think it's about time that we discussed fonts. We can change the font style to be italic, so that's going to give us italic text. We can set the font weight. Some fonts actually support a really granular level of up to 9 different font weights, set by 100, 200, 300, 400. We can transform the text. In this case, we're making the text uppercase, even though it was lowercase in the HTML. And we can also use the text align attribute to align the text. This, of course, needs to be inside an element that's not inline, because if you only have text itself, you need to know what width you're centering it in. Now, if we want to change the font, then we use the font family attribute for that. And if you type that into your text editor, it's going to suggest the different web safe fonts. So that's the fonts that you can expect every browser to know. And that's also why when you're selecting these, you have a series of multiple fonts. So these are fonts for different systems or different browsers that look at least similar. So you can't know that you're getting exactly the right font, but at least you'll get one of them. But it might be a little bit different on an Apple computer than on a Windows computer, in a Chrome browser, in a Firefox browser, and so on. If you want to add your own more interesting custom fonts, I discussed this in my HTML video as well, but you can go into Google Fonts, you can click on Getting Started, you can copy this link to a style sheet in order to get a Google font in there, and all you have to do is then replace that last word with the actual word of a font that you like. So go into fonts.google.com, find a good font. I want some handwriting this time. And once I find one that I like, I'm taking shadows into light, I'm copying that, and I'm replacing the word tangerine with that, and then I'm replacing the spaces with plus signs. Now the font is available, and I can go into style, and I can replace the font family with single quotes, and inside that I write the name of the font, shadow into light. And you can see that now I'm using that font from Google Fonts. Another quick thing we can do with fonts that we also went over in the HTML video is use Font Awesome. So I'm just Googling Font Awesome CDN, I'm going into CDN.js, and then I'm copying the HTML element to import Font Awesome. So right under this Google font, I'm just pasting the address to Font Awesome. I'm hitting save, and now that's available as well. Then I can go into fontawesome.com/icons, and this time I want to search for a smile. I'm still using the free ones because otherwise they're not going to show up when you use the link that I just showed you. And we have this HTML content here that we can put directly where we want it. So when I hit refresh, that's going to show up. So why am I showing you this in a CSS video? Well, maybe you'll want to add a pizza slice before your headline 2s. So right now I'm copying the Unicode up here, and I'm saying h2, then the pseudo class before font family is going to be Font Awesome, and content is going to be that Unicode that I just copied, but preceded by a backslash. So when I do that and I jump on over into the browser, it's going to add a pizza slice before any h2 that I have on the page. Now you can use this to do a neat little trick that I do sometimes. This is a simple version. You might want to do something with the margins to make things look a little bit better, but the general concept is really simple. You have an unordered list on the right in your HTML, and I'm giving it the class check, because then whenever I add that class to a list, I can make it a checklist. So in my CSS, all I do is that I take ULs with the class check, and I set the list style type to none. That's going to remove the bullets that exist. And then I'm using the before elements on the ULs that have the class check, and then on every LI element nested under that, I use the before element to set the font family to Font Awesome and the content to \F00C, which is the Unicode in Font Awesome for a check mark. And that gives me a checklist rather than a normal unordered list. So it's time to go crazy. Let's play around with some of these crazier things that CSS can do. First of all, let's try rotating and skewing things. So we can use the transform attribute to rotate something. Here it's set to 45 degrees, -45 degrees. Or I can say skew and then set the degrees that I want to skew something on the X and the Y axis. But we can go even further. These squares, they're kind of boring, right? So I can say clip path, and then I can set up a polygon. And then I can start mentioning the points that I want on the screen. So let me start by going 0% of the screen down and 50% of the screen in. Now it's just showing the box whenever the syntax is invalid and it's disappearing whenever it is valid until there is something to actually show. I'm going from 50% down to the top left corner to 50% down and 50% in to 50% down and 100% in, and that's giving me that shape. But, you know, it's a little bit difficult to work with it like that. So I prefer using this clippy tool by Bennett Feely, where I can just select the shape and then drag these handles around. Then it generates this exact attribute for me, and I can just copy that over into my own CSS. So if I go in here and disable the clip path that I just set up and paste this one instead, I'm getting that beautiful shape that I just created over in the clippy tool. So enough with the crazy stuff. Sometimes we want to build something that looks different on different sizes of screens. So I'm using the media rule, denoted with an @ sign, to say I have some CSS that should only apply when the screen is less than 400 pixels wide. That's why it says add media, only screen, and max width of 400 pixels. So this CSS is only applied on screens when the width of that screen is 400 pixels. On screens, yeah, we'll get to those screens in the next bit, but let's talk about this first. H1 elements and I elements become red when the screen is smaller, and the font size of those elements become 24 pixels. So notice how the headline is actually getting smaller and red when the screen is getting smaller. And for the image, the text and the icon actually just moves right under it instead. And the image gets to have a width of 100% once the screen is small enough for that, and then a height of only 40%. But we can also use that media to set something specific for print. So here I'm saying that when I'm printing something out, the image shouldn't be displayed. The header should be green and the I element should be 200 pixels. So now when I print this out and you can see the preview, the headline is green and the paw is big. Now the last thing that we want to go through is going to be animation. So this is keyframe animation. So the idea is that on the image, I set the animation attribute, and the first word that I use is the name of the animation. So that's any word that you decide for yourself. After that, you set how long the animation is going to be. I've set it to 3 seconds. And then there's some other attributes that you can add to it, like linear and infinite. Infinite is going to loop the animation. That's why it's running over and over and over again. Now under that, I've set up this special selector saying add keyframes and then my animation. So that word my animation needs to match the word up under animation. And then I have my curly brackets to define what's going to happen inside my animation. So I can set up steps here to say that when 10% of the 3 seconds that the animation is going to last has gone by, the height is going to be 100 pixels and I'm going to transform it to rotate 45 degrees. Then when 50% of my 3 seconds have passed, the height is going to be 200 pixels and I'm going to transform it to rotate to minus 45 degrees. And when you get to 100%, once the 3 seconds have passed, the regular CSS kicks in. So that's why it keeps animating away from what it's doing now, down to those 300 pixels in height and width. But since I have that infinite loop on it, once it reaches 100%, it just starts over from 0% and starts animating towards the values that are giving in these different percentages. And I can add as many percentages in here that I want. Now we've gone over a bunch of crazy stuff, and you might run into situations where some of these things don't work exactly the way that you expected them to. There is actually a difference between how CSS is interpreted between browsers. Now, it's not nearly as much of a problem in 2023 as it used to be, but there is something called an acid test. And I'm just going to show you here for the Chrome browser I'm using right here today that it actually only gets 97 out of 100 points when we try to see how well it interprets CSS. If I were to look at this from another browser, the result would look slightly different. So that's just to say that you might run into problems that are actually because of the browser, especially if you're trying to do CSS with Internet Explorer. When I've done these courses in the past, that's been a whole topic in and of itself, but it seems like we're moving far enough away from Internet Explorer that we don't need to have that section in our courses anymore. So just be aware that if someone's actually using your site with Internet Explorer and they say that something doesn't work, that's definitely true. a lot of these things don't work in Internet Explorer. I just feel like so few people are using it now that we don't need to put that asterisk up front in the video anymore, and we don't need to talk so much about what to do about it anymore. So with all that being said, congratulations! You made it through an entire CSS course. You know CSS now. You can sit down and make any page look exactly how you want to. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't we go over tables or forms? Well, you actually already know exactly how to work with these things because CSS is not specific to the type of element. If you want to do something with a table, you have your selectors, you have your attributes, and you can do anything that you want with them. Same with forms. So you can make anything look the way that you want to. From here on out, it's just going to be your imagination setting the limits. That's going to be all for our complete CSS course. We're going to follow this up with a database course because once you know your HTML and your CSS and your database, you're all set to go deep into back-end programming when you know exactly what you're going to send it out to in the front end and what data you're going to be working with. And once that's available, I'm going to post it in a link in the description below here. But feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell and all those YouTube things to be notified whenever it's available. Thank you for now, and I'll see you next time.